Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Every Day is Saturday. I'm Matt Stahl, along with my partner, Brad Gatto. And we are revisiting a series we've been doing. We're doing a book review of the book, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel today. Before we jump into that, Brad.
Chapter 6 today.
Chapter 6. What's new?
You would think I would prepare for this, and then I would have good answers for you.
You just gave me the what's new right before we started this. So
we just got back from a shortened spring break trip, non-traditional spring break trip. We've gone south the last 3 years, as most people do most years. This year we went west and checked out San Francisco and up into wine country a little bit.
Sounds like cool
with our boys. Yeah, it was very different from sitting on a beach and just enjoying the sun. It wasn't like warm there.
Yeah,
it wasn't cold either. Sweatshirts kind of got the job done. But we did Alcatraz with our boys, which was super interesting. I'm a big history guy. And so Alcatraz's history goes all the way back to the gold rush. And before it was a prison, it was there as a fort, and then it was a military base. And so I loved it. The boys were kind of creeped out by it a little bit, because if you've been to Alcatraz, I don't know if it's always been this way. I doubt it. But now there's no like guide. You just get a head.
Oh, really?
Huh. And it tells you where to walk, and it says you should be standing in front of this, and then it talks to you about that deal. And so we all have the headphones on, and so you're all kind of in your own little bubble, like listening to this.
Yeah.
And you're not confident that you're on the exact same page as your kids, because they might be a little in front of you or a little bit behind you, but to watch their faces as, because it's narrated by some of the guards and some of the actual prisoners.
Really?
Yeah. And the day we were out there, one of the prisoners that spent 1.5 years in Alcatraz was there signing a book that he wrote about his time on the rock. Older gentleman, obviously. Alcatraz has been shut down since 1963, I want to say.
Yeah.
So anyway, fun trip.
Yeah.
Back at it though.
Back at it.
Ready to talk psychology money. How about you?
Similar experience. We went west as well for our spring break. And
you went to Alcatraz?
We did not go to Alcatraz. I've only spent a short amount of time in San Francisco. We did not plan ahead enough to get an Alcatraz tour. So we went west. We had a similar experience with the weather. All right. We came to the conclusion after this, the trip was amazing. We went to Zion National Park. Never been there. Incredible landscape. It's extremely beautiful. Did some hiking. Loved it. However, we did come to the conclusion that we're going to go somewhere tropical next year for spring break. We did get some sunshine, but not. Yeah. I mean, it's been one of those winters here. Correct.
Yeah. As we record this, the day after we left for our spring break, it snowed 5 inches, I was told.
Yeah.
Here. It is windy and nasty out today, but supposedly it's going to be 60 here on Saturday. So not that mid-April is, it's about time.
It is about time. All right. Let's begin.
If you're new to the podcast, or this is the first episode that you've listened to, Matt and I randomly, we don't do this every episode, but we've been going through this book called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. If you have not heard of this book, you have now. And if you have not read this book, you should. We've given away a lot of copies of this book. It's a phenomenal read, and it doesn't get into the nuts and bolts of money like a lot of books do. But what it does is talk about our behavior around money and the psychology around it. So we've just been kind of tackling it chapter by chapter on random episodes. And this week, we're on chapter 6 called Tails You Win. The subtitle is You Can Be Wrong Half the Time and Still Make a Fortune.
Yes. So I think it makes sense to, before we dig into that, we talked about this. The first thing that comes to my mind when I hear that is a coin flip.
Correct. Yeah.
So let's explain what is actually meant by tails in this context.
Yeah, it's the extremes, right? So whether it's in business or in life, we all know that there's like the normal, right? As defined by the 95% of the time or 99% of the time, this is kind of how things work. And then there's these extreme tail ends of good and bad.
Yeah.
And so when he's talking about tails, that's what he's referencing, is kind of like that 1 in 100, 1 in a million type chance.
Yeah. So in engineering speak, it's a distribution curve, bell curve, right?
In financial speak, it's standard deviations, right?
Yes. The two ends of the tail on the distribution curve. So
yeah, and he gives a lot of anecdotal stories. One that I want to reference specifically that we want to start with here is a guy by the name of Walt Disney. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
No?
What did he do?
couple things. He made a couple movies. He's got couple small theme parks.
Theme parks. Oh, I'll check them out.
Yeah. The story of Walt Disney as we know it today, though, is one of, obviously wild success. Not only does, the Disney company, as far as making movies is concerned, one of the most successful companies of all time, but then also, Disneyland, Disney World, not just here in the United States, they have Disney's in other parts of the world as well.
Right.
We see that part of the story and it's just a wild success.
Right. Well, legacy, impact, not only just the Disney brand itself and what the material things that we see, but what that created and laid out for possibility beyond that too. So huge impact. Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, most people recognize that name. I would most do anyway. And if you dig into, I don't know if have you listened to the biography of, or read any of the biography of Walt Disney?
I have not read the biography. I've listened to podcasts on.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. It is, I've not made it all the way through, but I've made it far enough to have read some of this about just the wild ideas. I mean, the wild ideas he had, and Morgan goes through that in this book and talks about the tail end for him was really Snow White.
Yeah.
And the Seven Dwarfs. And,
in 1938.
Yep.
Is when that movie came out.
Yeah.
It's a couple years ago. But prior to that, a lot of failure.
Yeah. 400 cartoons were created before
Snow White.
Yeah.
And most of them were losers.
Yes.
Like he was losing money hand over fist and he had a lot of debt. And a lot of that debt was financed at extreme rates.
Yes. That was the fascinating part.
Yeah.
Terms were not favorable
at all. And if makes sense when you start thinking about the timing of it, because if Snow White came out in 1938, they didn't start creating it in 38. Maybe let's just say it was 36. I don't know. Let's just say it was 1936. From a timing perspective, that's not 1935, 36 was still on the back end of the Great Depression.
Right.
It's not like it was over. I know a lot of people think of 1929, 1930, 31, but it's not like the economy had recovered to a point where people were just kind of back to normal in 1935, 36. And so it wasn't exactly a great economic time for people to be taking out debt.
Right. And by the sounds of it, he had expectations that exceeded reality to a degree. Yeah. So you combine those two things together and that could potentially create a mess. And they were on the verge of bankruptcy.
Yep.
And Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was kind of the tail end for that ended up being a financial success that allowed them to pay off the debts.
Yep.
Retain some key employees.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would argue that if Snow White had not worked, like that was it. They were basically kind of at the end of the rope. And you could say he got lucky in some ways. Obviously, it's a timeless movie that everybody still loves today. But yeah, they were on the verge of collapse, so to speak. And then he, foray into, after that success, they build a brand new studio that actually still there today, all these things that the part of Disney most of us probably know. Then, of course, he creates Disneyland right down the road. But then in that biography, I've not read that, but I've, again, heard some podcasts and stuff. Do you know the story about Disney World in Florida and how the craziness that he had to go through to procure all that land? He was using World War II veterans that were like CIA spy type people.
Oh my gosh.
To try to procure land in Florida and not let anybody know it was him that was buying it because of some of the mistakes he had made with Disneyland in California that he didn't want to remake with Disney World. And it was just this whole thing and how he had to fight with the state of Florida to get, anyway, it's a crazy story. Like by all accounts, Disney World should not exist the way that it does. And so it's just, again, right on the edge of success and failure. But as of 2023, we all know Disney, the company, to be a hyper successful company.
Yeah. Anyway, you say luck. Part of that, we could also point to, in the same pattern we see come up over and over again with some of the anecdotal stories, is just, if it weren't for those 400 cartoons that came before that and just to continue going, the tail doesn't show up. Right. So yes, we could contribute some of it to luck, but some of it is just the sheer amount of effort put into that.
Yep.
That's what created that tail event. And he references in here the 83 minutes of Snow White is really all that matters. I mean, through all that material that was created.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In fact, I mean, to go to something more modern, I mean, we know Apple is a behemoth and a super successful company. Amazon, same thing. In fact, we know the names of the CEOs, at least passing. We know the name of Steve Jobs. We know the name of Jeff Bezos. But those companies, same thing. Like, yes, they're wildly successful. Their market capitalizations are, bigger than people 50 years ago probably ever thought was possible.
Right.
Yet, when you look at their story of where they've spent their money on tech and R&D and the products that have driven their success, there's far more failure than success.
Right.
But then you get the invention of the iPhone and Apple turns around. You get, Amazon has all these things that they throw out, like to use the same, like the Fire phone. They came out with their own phone.
Right.
Massive flop. Didn't work out at all. And both companies have little subsets of things that they've done like that inside of the greater company that have been huge failures.
Yeah. In fact, I want to read the message that Jeff Bezos put out after the Fire phone. So, an example of if I was a large stakeholder or shareholder in Amazon, and there was something that was that much of a failure, I may expect some sort of apology from the CEO. And Jeff Bezos, the statement he made after the Fire phone that was a massive failure was, if you think that's a big failure, we're working on much bigger failures right now. I am not kidding. Some of them are going to make the Fire phone look like a tiny little blip. So what his message really was, hey, it's okay for Amazon to lose this much money on this because it's offset by Amazon Web Services or Prime or these other programs that are massive successes that are the tails within that company itself.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's good at this point to, one of the things Morgan talks about in this chapter is VC money or venture capital money. And I whether you fully understand venture capital firms or maybe this is the first time you've heard the name, most people know at least enough to know that they're far more risky, right? Because you're getting venture capital money is going into these startup companies. And it stands to reason in our brains that a lot of startups fail.
Yep.
Right. I don't think that anybody would, not agree with that without seeing any sort of factual data. But what's interesting in this chapter, he goes through some of the numbers inside of venture capital firms and how much money is made or how much money is lost. And I think the stats, Matt, were from 2004 to
2014.
To 14.
So, yeah, here I have them right here. So this was a study of more than 21,000 venture financings. And the stats go like this. So 65% of them lost money. 2.5% of the investments made 10x to 20x. 1% made more than a 20x return, and 0.5%. So if we're looking at 21,000 companies, 100 of those earned 50x or more. And that's where the vast majority of the return comes from, right? In a VC firm.
And allows you to take the 65% of your investments are literally just going to go to zero.
Yeah. And that's the expectation. That's completely within the expectation of that world. So I don't think that's probably a surprise to most people that are somewhat familiar with how venture capital works or has, dug into that at all. What is actually really surprising is that he then takes that to the public market, which you or I or anyone we run into has access to. And we I would think most people wouldn't expect that same sort of
volatility, failure.
Yeah.
So the reference he gives there, so switching from now startups to publicly traded companies like Matt was talking about, the index that he's referencing in the book is the Russell 3000 index because, big, broad, massive index, 3,000 components, 3,000 companies. And inside of that index, effectively all of the overall returns came from 7% of the companies inside of the index, less than 10%, 7%.
It's crazy.
From a failure perspective, what was the stat inside the book? Something like 40% of the companies in the index.
Yeah, 40% of all Russell 3000 lost at least 70% of their value and never recovered over that period. But I have to point out one example in here because we are both children of the 80s.
Yep.
So one example he gives is this company, Carroll Co., which went public in 1987.
Yep.
This production company was behind Rambo, Terminator 2, Total Recall, and Basic Instinct.
They really liked Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone.
As children of the 80s, those movies jump out. And so he does go through the example of it was a massive success, hit after hit. The revenue.
$500 million in 91.
Yeah. And then it failed.
Just gone. By 1996, 5 years later.
History. Just
Did $500 million of revenue in 91, and 5 years later it was gone.
Stock goes to zero. Have a nice day.
As he quotes in the book. It's crazy. The Russell 3000 has increased more than 73-fold, that index, since 1980. Just since 1980, not even the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Yet the vast majority of the return is coming from 7% of the companies inside of that index.
Crazy.
So whether it's the super risky venture capital world or it's the actual world of publicly traded companies, there's just tails drive a lot of the overall success when it comes to when you look at any individual company, like we've given examples of Apple or Amazon or Walt Disney, but also on the broader perspective of investing over time.
Right.
And so what's the application there, right? Like, what do we take from this? Like, how do we as investors try to learn from this idea that most of the time you're going to be wrong?
Right. Well, there's a quote in here. It's from Napoleon, which I don't love.
But like short people or what?
Yeah, totally. No. So, Napoleon, most of us are familiar with the military, quote unquote, genius of Napoleon. A quote that's in here that I think really applies to just the day-to-day application of this is the man or person who can do the average thing when all those around him or them are going crazy.
Yep.
And that for me really brings it home to how this applies, especially coming off the experience we've had over the past few years. That really brings it home and applies to what we feel.
The man who can do the average thing when all those around him are going crazy.
What do you think that means? As far as application goes.
Well, when you say it in the context of Napoleon, in my head, I get the visual of war.
Yeah.
Which I would probably be one of the people going crazy and not be able to keep my level head, which means I'm one of the people that's going to die. But it is that way with the markets. We've experienced it recently. In fact, you could make the argument we're still experiencing it, still very high volatility.
Right.
With a pullback here last year, 2023 hasn't exactly been stellar to this point. It's not bad, but it's not been good. There's just a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty right now in the markets. And it's hard to be the person that's not going crazy.
Yeah. The one example he brings up, an experience that you and I both share. Yes, it's been crazy. Yet it does not compare to 2008 and 2009 up to this point, right?
No.
As far as just the sheer numbers. So an example of staying normal, just doing the normal thing when everyone else is going crazy would be if I had all my nest egg invested and I decided to pull it all out when we were at the very, very bottom. That would be an example of a tail on the wrong end.
Right.
Of something we would not want to experience, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. And he gives an example of that in here. He gives 3 different, again, anecdotal stories of hypothetical people, Sue, Jim, and Tom.
Yep.
Sue just puts $1 in the market every single day and never stops. Jim times some things out with recessions, depending on when he gets in and when he gets out. And Tom does the same thing. I'm not going to go through all the details. But quite frankly, from a Jim and Tom perspective, guys that are trying to time the market a bit relative to when it's going up and when it's going down, he's actually pretty nice to them.
Right.
By the assumptions he makes. It's not like he's giving them, like making them time it all wrong. Like he's actually giving them some of the benefit of the doubt. And frankly, Jim and Tom, by all accounts, would consider themselves successful investors of market timing. But by the end of the story, Sue ends up with almost twice as much money as both of them.
Yeah. You think he purposely made the two that tried to time the market men and the
I don't know. That's a great question, Matt. I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But the bottom line is by keeping cool and just staying invested and not trying to chase those tails. Because at the end of the day, even as like take these VC firms that are getting into these non-publicly traded companies, these startup style companies. And when you're going to make an investment, they know everything about the company. They know all their financials. They know what makes them tick. They know where their projected revenue is going to be for the next 1, 3, and 5 years. They know what their expenses, their debt ratios. They know all of that data intimately, and they still choose to make the investment. And even with all of that information and knowledge and all those things, 65% of the time they fail.
And that's what they expect.
And they expect it to. Yet we get into the market, we buy ABC Mutual Fund. We have no idea what's even in the fund. We don't even know what we just bought. We just know it's large cap growth companies, or it's mid cap value, or core, or blend, or whatever. But opening the hood and understanding which companies we just bought, let alone the financials of those companies, it's just hard to not think that a lot of your investments are going to fail. And really what we're hoping for is a small percentage of them to do good, an even smaller percentage to do great, and a very, very tiny percentage to be what drives the vast majority of long-term return.
Yeah. And a really real world example of this where we'd experience this is having that conversation where someone will get really fixated on one particular strategy or investment.
Yeah.
So for example, say we were to hold 18 different funds and an annuity, or could be any sort of strategy, and we end up paying attention to one of those, just watching the roller coaster go up and down.
Yep.
And taking our eye off the ball of how's this overall strategy working together for us, as opposed to what is this particular investment doing? And I think you and I have both seen where that can do not so great things for people's mental wherewithal when it comes to riding the roller coaster, right?
Yeah. I mean, even being a business owner myself, the failures scream louder.
Yes.
Their voice is much louder than the successes are.
But you better have them.
Yeah. No,
if you don't have some of them, that means you're not doing anything, right? So that's another example that goes through in here is any successful person that you run into has a trail of failures as well, right? And there's no such thing as someone not having something.
Yeah, and every time you look around, that's a great point. I think that's a good place to try to wrap this up is when you look around at the people around you, whether it's, in your sphere, it's family, it's loved ones, it's neighbors, it's friends, it's whoever. And let's just say they're ahead of you in life by a few years and you're just like, gosh, I wish I could be them when I get there. Or maybe it's somebody that's a generation older than you. It's your parents, it's your grandparents, or what have you. And you look at where they stand and you're like, gosh, I just want to be that. I want to be there. What you don't understand is like the Walt Disney story or the Apple story or the Amazon, like what the pain that they went through, the failures that they went through to get where they're at. And they were the person, assuming, because you're looking up to them in my hypothetical example here, that when everything was going crazy around them was able to kind of keep a level head and keep a level mind and just kind of stay the course. When I look at the families that we interact with, Matt, you think about one of my favorite things about what we do is meeting the average person that has done average things, but done them for a very long period of time. And I don't mean average in any, negative way. I mean, just not like your super high paying job, not a job that was a big status symbol or just all these sorts of things, but they just and you meet them and they're wealthy beyond their imagination. They're super happy, all these things. And it's just, we see it time and time again. And it's because there's the Sues of the world, not the Jims and Toms.
No offense if you're a Jim or a Tom.
That we're able to kind of keep a level head. We hear it a lot in visits with prospective families that we're in the process of partnering with or existing families that we work with now that tell us. And it's not like a one-off or I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say, but we hear it. It's so consistent. Like, well, I just didn't look at my accounts.
Right. Yeah.
It's always the people that they were able to keep a level head because they didn't focus on the negatives or focus on the account. They just kind of closed their eyes and let it do what it did. And because of that, and they're always the people too that say, well, gosh, maybe I should have paid more attention. I'm like, no,
No,
you shouldn't have.
They also didn't fix it in the positives. You said fixating the negatives. They also didn't fix it in the positives because that can work against you as well. So it's kind of, staying.
See one thing in your portfolio win.
Yes.
You've got that, and then you dump that direction.
Right.
And then it goes back, it regresses back to the mean, invents the Fire Phone, and the stock plummets.
So,
Oh man,
perfect example of create a plan, stick to it, know when to adapt. But that's the secret sauce, right?
well, understanding the details exists and knowing that you're not going to be able to perfectly find those tails. Right. And that you're going to see more failure than you will success, but there's a certain number of successes along the way that will drive the vast majority of your positive outcomes when it comes to investing.
Absolutely.
I think we wrapped it up pretty good there.
Yeah. I thought we were going to share a list of all of our failures.
Have you ever listened to Dan Carlin's podcast, Hardcore History?
I've listened to a few of them.
Yeah. They're like 6 hours long, every episode. That's what this would be if we had to sit there and list all of our failures. Then that would be some hardcore history.
That would be hard.
And I don't want to step on Dan Carlin's toes. So we're not going to do that today. But thanks for tuning in to another episode of Every Day is Saturday. My name is Brad Gatto, here with Matt Stahl, again, partner in crime on this podcast. We genuinely love doing this. So thanks again for listening to this episode. If you have not yet subscribed, we'd ask you to do that. Tell your family, your friends about the podcast, have them come join us as well. And it's always fun doing Psychology of Money. It's actually, what's funny is we're 6 chapters in, there's 20 chapters of this book. It's probably going to take us another year to get through the rest of it. And I'm already lamenting it being over.
Yeah.
We're probably going to just have to do it again. So anyway, thanks for joining us again for this episode, and we'll see you all next Saturday.
Thank you for listening to Every Day is Saturday. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Fiat Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.